thanks to the campaigning efforts of everybody in this room and of the family and many, many other people, I think Shaka's name is now really well known, not only in Britain, but in many other places. And the other thing that's very well known is Shaka's innocence. As I said, the British government know he's innocent. The American government know he's innocent. He's been cleared twice by very high-level intelligence agencies in America. There's no question of his complete innocence. The other thing that is very well known is Shaka's suffering. And I'm not going to say much about that. In fact, I'm not going to say anything about his health or his treatment. So much has been said by his lawyers, and I've probably read by everybody here. But what I want to say is, after this week, I think we're in a new position, in that a new thing is known about Shaka, which is his voice. After the powerful American media company CBS was allowed to have a tour of Guantanamo and taken to the wing where Shaka is, as many of you will know, because Ray has, among other things, circulated a link to the CBS, you can actually hear Shaka's powerful and very moving words, and I'm going to repeat them. Tell the world the truth. Please, we are tired. Either you leave us to die in peace, or tell the world the truth. Let the world hear what's happening. Shaka also said, you can't walk even half a meter without being shackled. Is that a human being? It's an animal, the treatment of an animal. Now, I want to talk, instead of about the treatment, and instead of about Shaka's health, and instead of about his family, I want to talk about two very different aspects of all of this, which I think are raised by the CBS report. And I think they're things for all of us to reflect on after 11 years. The first is Shaka's personality, and the way he's kept his humanity. And that's been done by his constant campaigning, not for himself, but for everybody in Guantanamo Bay, for their justice and for their freedom. And he's done that campaigning at a tremendous cost to his health, obviously because of the successive hunger strikes and many other things. And I think the kind of person he is, he took on this responsibility, that he would be that voice. He would make people know what is Guantanamo Bay. And he took that responsibility knowing very well that around him in Guantanamo Bay were people who could not do that. Either they were too young, they were too old, they were sick, or they were not educated. And it's years since other prisoners chose Shaka as the negotiator with the American authorities to end the first hunger strike over the way the Qurans were being treated. And he stood out at that point, not just because of his language skills, educated in America, but as many former prisoners have said many times over, for his fearlessness, his generosity, and his preparedness to fight for everybody. And the main thing was the fight for them to be treated justly and as human beings. As he said in his work, that's not what they're being treated. Now, the second thing that came into my mind watching the CBS thing was hearing the statements of the Joint Detention Group commander, Colonel John Bogdan. He considers himself to be at war with the prisoners who are under his control. In fact, I had to watch the program twice to take in these words. This is what he said. These men are enemies to us, just as we are enemies to them. Now, this colonel is talking about 164 men, and 86 of them, including Shaka, have, as I said earlier, been cleared by the American authorities. How can this colonel consider himself to be at war with these individuals? then went on to talk about his greatest preoccupation in Guantanamo. And it wasn't about hunger strikes. His big preoccupation is that the soldiers working in the prison have twice the level of post-traumatic stress disorder as soldiers on the battlefield, American soldiers on the battlefield. And he explained this as coming from the fact that, I'm quoting him again, they have enemy contact 12 hours a day, and they fear physical assault. Now, all the guards wear gloves and plastic face masks constantly, as we've seen in the film. It doesn't take a psychiatrist, I think, to work out some of the reasons why these young soldiers may be feeling mentally disturbed. There's also the testimony of former guards who left the service completely disgusted with what they personally had been doing. I think we all know that guilt can play on the mind. Anyway, back to physical assault. There's plenty of physical assaults in Guantanamo Bay. There are former prisoners, some of whom you know, who have lost an eye, whose backs or shoulders have been permanently damaged, and there are others who've lost their minds as a result of what's happened to them in Guantanamo Bay. And what physical assault in Guantanamo Bay means is half a dozen soldiers chosen for their strength and size in full body armor entering a cell where there is a single man, beating him down, shackling him, and taking him out of the cell for solitary confinement or interrogations or some form of punishment. And these ERF teams, as they're called, Extreme Reaction Force, are, by all accounts, and there are plenty of accounts, extremely violent actions is what they do. Physical assault, I'd call it. Anyway, thousands of young American men and women have been part of all this for 12 years. And they've participated in things that I think they'll never forget. And I hope they'll never forget. Now, since Colonel Bogdan took over last year, his men and his regime has been deliberately confrontational with the prisoners. There have been invasive searches of the men's bodies after they were trying to leave their cells to meet their lawyers or make a phone call, and many of them have been deterred from meeting their lawyers or making the phone calls because of those searches. There's been the ransacking of cells, removal of personal items, and again, we're back to the searching of Qurans. On February the 6th of this year, the searching of Qurans issue sparked the hunger strike, the latest in the series of hunger strikes. Now, at one point, this hunger strike, starting in February, had more than half the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay on hunger strike. It's testimony to how incredibly strong their feelings were against Bogdan's regime and against the growing hopelessness of, are we ever going to be released? Bogdan himself distinguished himself again by publicly attempting to downplay the extent of the hunger strike and the seriousness of it. However, at the same time, in the United States, the lawyers for many of the prisoners went into complete overdrive, and you couldn't get away from those lawyers in the media. And they made a very successful stab at really publicizing what their clients were going through, many of them in connection with talking to their clients, which included Shaka. And within quite a few weeks last spring, other powerful media organizations like the New York Times and the Boston Globe began to call for the first time for the closure of Guantanamo Bay. And so did various senators begin to call for all the men who'd been cleared to be allowed to go back to where they came from. So it felt as though the tide was changing. And at the same time, hundreds of American citizens, people just like us here, donned their orange jumpsuits like you. They made hunger strikes in front of the White House. They marched, they demonstrated in many, many communities all over the United States. And I was in America at that time, and I had for a moment a memory of when Obama took power and said he was going to close Guantanamo Bay. I'm sure you all remember that moment of exhilaration and hope, which was, of course, completely dashed. And unfortunately, of course, it's been dashed again. Since then, just one prisoner has been released back to Algeria. And Colonel Bogdan, who came under terrific criticism and challenges to his fitness for his job, is still in his job. And the hunger strike has been at least partially broken. Meanwhile, the charade of justice in the military courts on the island continues. However, I always think it's important to realise we're not completely alone, and we have our own MPs, but they're quite few. It's great that we have the representative of Jane Ellison and John McDonnell, who can always be counted on for these things. But in the last week, a group of 38 high-ranking former military officers wrote to Congress, which is engaged in a very detailed, nitpicking wording of the latest annual National Defense Authorization Act. It's going to affect the question of whether the men can leave the prison. These generals wrote to Congress, and they wrote these words: "Guantanamo is a betrayal of American values. The prison is a symbol of torture and justice delayed. And as the United States ends the war of Afghanistan in 2014, the government must find a lawful disposition for all detainees captured as part of that war." The letter is a good reminder of next year there will be a new legal barrage against the administration on how can you still be holding people for a war that no longer exists. We should of course remember that the very large majority of people in Guantanamo Bay had nothing to do with the war in Afghanistan. Now, over these nearly 12 years, hundreds of American lawyers, and many here too, have worked tirelessly on this business of trying to get due process, and they've been knocked back over and over again by appeals. Every time they win anything, there's an appeal from government lawyers which overturns that victory. And they're still working to end this limbo that Shaka and these other men have found themselves in. Now, some of the prisoners know what that limbo is. I'm referring to the Yemenis, which are the largest group of people who've been cleared. After the 2009 attempted aircraft bombing at Christmas, President Obama personally said, "Nobody is leaving the United States for Yemen." That was it for them. Now, in May last year, at the height of the hunger strike, he actually rescinded that order. But has one Yemeni gone back to Yemen? No. But other men, like Shaka, do not know why they're in this limbo. And in the CBS film, there's a moment when Clive Stafford Smith is asked, as one of the lawyers for Shaka, do you know, does he know why he's not released? And Clive said, as he has said it so many times, no, none of us have ever been told anything. We have no idea. So we're living now, after these 11, 12 years, in what I call a new normality, imposed since that careless phrase, the war on terror of the Bush era. And I'm just going to list you some of the elements which are new. And when you see young people at meetings like this, they have been born into this new normality. Prisoners can be held indefinitely, without charge or trial. The Geneva Conventions are ignored. Torture and abuse are widespread. The judiciary is completely politicized. And we have new military technology which kills civilians indiscriminately. Now, when Shaka shouted out from his cell that the men in Guantanamo are tired, I thought, what an extraordinary understatement that is from such an extraordinary man. Now, the Guantanamo lawyers that I spoke about earlier, they're tired too. They're tired from their failures. They've failed too often. And they've also seen people burn out along the way. And they've actually seen some of the lawyers who, at the beginning, were with us have now become part of the administration. And I think it's true to say that yes, we are all tired too. We're tired of banging our heads against the brick wall of stupidity and moral indifference which allows Guantanamo to continue. But, however tired we are, I know that we will not stop campaigning. That's an absolute promise, and I'm sure I make it on behalf of everybody in this room. We will never stop campaigning until not just Shaka, but all those men come out of Guantanamo Bay and are back with their families. I wish I could name all those people, and I know that if Shaka was here, he would want it to be an inclusive moment in which we think about everybody, and he is the symbol of that. And I want to leave you with the thought of the very tired families of all these prisoners who've been sustained through these terrible years only by their faith. And I want to read you just a very few words from the book that I wrote with some of the wives and daughters of these men, including Shaka's wife. I want you to remember the political context in which men like Shaka dreamed of contributing to a more just world. You may see their suffering today in a slightly different aspect. It's very short. Most of those who went to Afghanistan, like Shaka, believed that they were living differently, making sacrifices to help in creating a better world. It wasn't just hopes. We did create an international community which we were proud of and believed in. And that was what all the world digging and school building was all about. Of course, the Afghanistan that they went to was an imagined world, but it never represented any threat to anybody in the West. A perceived or invented threat lies behind every story, every family in this book. The threat and the reality of terrorism came from somewhere completely else. It came from deluded, marginalized men who believed violence was a shortcut to political change in their own societies and the Western societies allied with their rulers. Almost all the women in this book lived lives in which a harsh, everyday reality and the injustice suffered in the UK or the US in these years was intertwined with memories, ghosts and dreams of an Afghanistan or a Palestine, past or future. These other shadow lives infused everything for them if you came close enough to listen. And they were, with their faith, their secret lifeline of joy and resilience against bitterness and despair. So bitterness and despair is not an option for us. However tired we are, we will continue with this. Thank you very much for listening.